for everyone out there, if any of you do not know who I am, I'm Allie Williams. I'm head of school here at the Pilot School, and we are absolutely thrilled once again to welcome Dr. Kami Winklespect back for our parent series. This is the second installment in our 21-22 parent series. Tonight, we'll be talking about social anxiety and friendship development. This is something that we deal with all the time during the school day, and as parents, it's a topic of high interest, something that comes up a lot as we're partnering with families and trying to really make a difference in the kind of full lives of the children in our care. And so we're really excited as we were kind of brainstorming the design of this year's series. Kami, kind of fleshed this out for us, and we were, really looking forward to this particular session. So I will stop talking and let Kami take it away. I'm going to turn my camera off, but I'll be here monitoring both the Q&A and the chat. Both are available for all of our attendees. So I know Kami always prefers high levels of participation. So I'll be here in the background trying to keep an eye on that so you can focus on the presentation. So
thank you.
That, I'll hand it over to you, Kami. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Sally. I appreciate that, and Janet. And I'm excited to be back with the pilot community this evening. And I will echo Allie's sentiment that I'm excited about this one. I felt like this was a really good addition to this series, and also something that we've seen a significant kind of increase in related to COVID and just some of the impact, which is part of what we'll talk about a little bit today. I do love participation, and there are several times that as we transition between topics where it's natural to then kind of ask a question or to clarify something. So please don't hesitate to do that throughout the presentation. We do have time saved at the end, of course, for questions, but feel free to kind of jump in and ask those questions throughout as well. All right, so I'll share my screen and we'll get going. Sorry, it was a little angry at me with my buttons on the bottom. I apologize. All right, here we go. All right, as I was thinking about putting this presentation together today too, I have to say I was looking for just different slides that would kind of be a good fit. And all of the slides that kept coming up when I type in friendship or kind of social development, like those types of things, all have pictures of kids holding hands. And I thought to myself, it's just so interesting, right? Thinking about that in the context of COVID, which is part of what we're going to kind of think about a little bit tonight, because I also feel like a picture like this, would not even really be something that would hardly happen, right? In our kind of current day and time. So I look forward to kind of thinking through this a little bit with you guys as we do a little bit more of a deep dive in terms of anxiety. So we did a broad anxiety last time. This one's a specific focus on social anxiety, but then generally really thinking about what are ways that we develop friendships? What are the skills that are required to really kind of help us think about that a little bit more broadly? Because everybody in some form or fashion is going to have social challenges, and that's pretty typical and developmentally appropriate. So we're going to go through kind of those stages and skills as well that would be applicable right outside of the context of social anxiety. So the purpose of this evening is really educational in nature. So it's not intended to be a substitute for a therapy intervention. Our focus is really kind of understanding and supporting kids from a CBT perspective. And that's just who I am as a provider. It's also what we know is the evidence-based treatment for anxiety and most other conditions in childhood, right? So depression as well. And again, anxiety, including social anxiety. So we'll approach it and have some examples from that framework. If you do feel like after listening to the presentation tonight that your child would benefit from a therapy intervention, please reach out to your awesome team at Pilot that could give you a list of resources. Or check out some of these resources below. There's one particular, the third one on the list is specifically related to social anxiety. And the National Social Anxiety Center has done an amazing job throughout the pandemic to really put together some resources that are helpful. These are helpful for actually parents and kids, just to help you kind of understand how to break down some of the skills into smaller parts, but also to think about how you would start to kind of approach some of these situations and give you kind of creative examples. So I feel like they've done a really stellar job at putting out free available resources for adults and parents and kids, as we've seen, again, an overwhelming, I think, increase in social anxiety related to the pandemic. So I'll just give that one a specific call out. So learning goals for this evening. First, we're going to talk about and understand social anxiety. So how is it a little bit different than generalized anxiety or OCD or kind of other types of anxiety? We're going to talk some about social and friendship development. So those social skills that are kind of required to be effective at navigating friendships, and then the stages of friendship development. So there are natural skills and transitions in friendship that happen throughout childhood. And so we'll just talk through those and kind of draw your attention to those phases and kind of stages a little bit. We're going to talk about the impact of the pandemic on social interactions for kids and teens. So it's, to me, very predictable that we would see a high increase in social anxiety as a function of the pandemic, because it drastically changed all of the social interactions that kids and teens are in, and it changed them immediately. And we'll talk about kind of what were some of the things that probably had the greatest impact or led to that impact a little bit more than others. But we're also going to think a little bit about how some of those things are continuing. And so how do we kind of start to navigate around that a little bit and hopefully catch up on some of these gaps that we've missed. And then we're going to talk about effective treatment. So what does treatment for social anxiety look like? Again, we'll approach that from a cognitive behavioral standpoint, but what are strategies to coach social interaction? So how do we think about, like, what are the skills? How do you try to break that down? And then what are some strategies to help you coach these effectively? Because all kids actually would benefit from social coaching and kind of friendship coaching, problem solving in social or kind of peer situations. And so I think hopefully this will give you some tips about how to kind of break that down and effectively do that at home. So first, we're going to talk about understanding social anxiety. So just as kind of a quick backdrop on the presentation, so this gives you kind of the base rate. So base rates are, what do we know are occurring kind of in these age ranges. And this is information from the CDC. It's not particular, right, to, like, you know, one group of people. This is a wide range of nationwide statistics about mental health in kids. And so we'll just look at that one in the middle, this anxiety. You'll see it increase pretty significantly, right? So 3 to 5-year-olds don't necessarily have a lot of anxiety disorders. 6 to 11-year-olds, they start to emerge. And then 12 to 17-year-olds, we see a huge spike in anxiety. And as we think about this today, I'll encourage you guys just to think about, as we talk about the stages of friendship and kind of the development that happens between 6 and 17, then I think it makes a lot of sense that you see this spike a little bit more when you get to kind of middle school and kind of 12 to 17, because the nature of the relationships from a social perspective really change and are more complex in a variety of ways. Kids also mature and develop in terms of their intellectual complexity and what do they understand and how do they think about, you know, kind of what other people are thinking about them. But again, you see those start to increase in those 6 to 11-year-old areas as well, because we start to appreciate kind of who we are and then what the world around us looks like in a variety of ways. So as a parent, just to kind of think about this a little bit up front. So as a parent, when should you worry about worry? I think it's helpful for us to talk about this a little bit up front, because we're going to think about, right, kind of social development. And again, it's very typical to struggle with different things. It's typical to experience anxiety, a certain amount of anxiety at times too. And even you could worry excessively, let's say for a week or 2 weeks, and that not necessarily be very problematic if it returns down to kind of its baseline level. But what we really want to be thinking about, and as you're kind of talking, we're talking through these points, and you're learning along with us this evening, is really focusing on impairment as the differentiator. So what would differentiate kind of an anxiety disorder versus kind of typical social stress or kind of social kind of anxiety that would be likely to resolve on its own, or social skills deficits that might just improve from coaching, is really this idea of impairment. So if you're really seeing impairment, meaning that the anxiety itself is preventing success in a variety of different ways. So is this anxiety preventing success at home, at school, and with peers? And when we look at the criteria, some of those are actually very specifically spelled out in the criteria for social anxiety disorder. Is it causing health difficulties? So we'll see a lot of younger kids in particular, so your 6 to 11-year-olds, you'll see many more like sleep challenges, kind of stomach issues, headaches, those types of things, trips to the school nurse. That might be signs, right, that you're starting to experience anxiety, because what happens for younger kids is their body starts to feel kind of uncomfortable, but they may not necessarily have the language to describe why, and they can't connect some of the dots as well as older kids do, that they have that kind of vernacular, that language related to anxiety a little bit more as they grow. And so you'll see these stomach challenges and kind of health difficulties come out in younger kids a little bit more. Is your child not achieving to their potential due to worry? Are they having kind of test anxiety, right? Are they worrying in situations about, raising their hand in class? We'll talk about an example. Are they not necessarily living up to kind of their potential because of this worry? Are they avoiding situations that create difficulty from them? So is it something that you feel like you can't necessarily kind of go to a family gathering? You can't necessarily go to a birthday party, those types of things. Situations that you would hope that your child would be pretty excited about or look forward to, kind of getting back to and thinking about from COVID, but would look forward to doing and creating that opportunity for social interaction. But are they avoiding those things because they are just really kind of panicked, worried, too stressed about it to consider doing it? How much time as a parent do you spend managing your child's worry? And I think that this is really a big one. We're kind of managing around it, this idea of accommodation. And so when worry starts to grow and be pretty excessive, it impacts, again, all of these different areas. But for kids and teenagers, oftentimes who's in the position to kind of see this the most are parents. And you're thinking about how much this impacts your day-to-day routine and what you have to modify because this worry is present. So how much do you have to give a lot of advance warning for different things and schedule changes and coach through different things and help them to take deep breaths and, kind of develop a way that they're going to coach themselves to kind of get to school every day. So if you're thinking about this at the end of the day as a parent, that you spend a lot of time coaching and managing around and kind of accommodating around the worry, that might be a sign that it's too much. And then who's in control? Your child or the anxiety? Do you get the sense sometimes, I think as a parent, we kind of trust our instincts. Sometimes I call it like your spidey sense, that your spidey sense as a parent says, I could really like to do this activity, but they just can't quite do that, right? We sign up and then they can't necessarily get there. And I really think there's something that's interfering with that this is an activity that from all the things that I know about them, they would really love and enjoy, and isn't necessarily something that they're able to do. So who's really making the decision in that situation? Is your child deciding that they don't want to do that activity? Or is it they'd really like to do it, but they feel so nervous that they're not able to kind of start that activity? So really thinking about this idea about who makes the decisions or who controls the outcome in those situations. And if you're kind of checking a lot of these boxes and thinking, yes, it is kind of creating some of that impairment, then that's when I encourage parents to really kind of think about whether kind of a therapy consultation to kind of talk through this or meeting with your child's pediatrician. Most of the time, pediatricians are an excellent resource to kind of start this conversation, and they can kind of help you to understand what might be a little bit more developmental and appropriate and what's not. Again, some pediatric practices actually have mental health services associated with them. The area of primary care, kind of pediatric psychology is certainly growing. So you might even be able to access kind of a consultation or a resource through that as well. But if you're starting to check off a lot of these boxes, then it might be time to kind of think about that because you want your child to really feel like they could be effective and that they're making the decisions for themselves and not necessarily the anxieties. So if we think about social anxiety disorder in particular, how social anxiety disorder overall, just as kind of a broad category, is different than other types of anxiety is it's really characterized by a fear of the child, what the child is thinking other people are going to think about them, basically. So the perceived fear and intense distress about social interactions where they might be kind of exposed to scrutiny or like evaluation by others. So this fear of negative evaluation and people kind of having negative impressions of them, embarrassing themselves, those types of things is really what characterizes social anxiety. So it's not necessarily just something that happens in larger groups or social situations. I feel like there are a lot of misconceptions about social anxiety disorder. And when it comes up in conversation or when I see this kind of in popular media a lot of times, it's really specifically related to the last criteria on this, which is there's a specific type of social anxiety that relates only to performance situations. So that if you were speaking in public, if you were on a stage and acting or singing or kind of presenting, and that you're really fearful and unable to perform in that situation, but all other social interactions were pretty typical. But that's not necessarily the most common. Actually, a lot of people are pretty nervous about presenting, but can work through that pretty successfully so that it doesn't present that level of impairment that we talked about a few minutes ago. There's also some change in the criteria, which I'll highlight, that's different for kids and adults. And I think it's helpful to understand that too. So social anxiety disorder overall is again characterized by this marked fear of anxiety in one or more social interactions. So it's usually not just one particular situation, but it's all of the different situations that you kind of encounter where you're in a social context. where you might have scrutiny from others, or you're worried that this negative evaluation is going to happen. So you might be worried about having conversations, presentations, eating in front of other people at the lunch table and what they're kind of thinking about your eating or how you're chewing, those types of things. That actually can be a really common fear for younger children because you're just not exposed to that usually before you get in a school setting. Meeting new people. Specifically in children, this meeting new people and kind of having conversations has to be present with other kids and not necessarily adults. So oftentimes the kind of age differential and the power differential between adults and kids can make talking with adults a little bit more intimidating. And so if kids are specifically just not talking to adults, then that wouldn't be something that would necessarily relate to social anxiety disorder. So it would have to be present across all different kind of ages of people that they'd be interacting with. Fear that they would do something in these social interactions that would result in a negative evaluation, so that they would say something that would be embarrassing, they would get an answer wrong in class if they volunteered and kind of raise their hand, they'd be rejected by others, so they'd ask to play and somebody would say no. Those fears really predict then behavior and avoidance of those situations. You also have consistency. So almost all situations are going to provoke some level of fear and anxiety. It doesn't mean that there are not situations that kids are successful in, but it means that by and large, right across these different categories, that social situations usually create a pretty high level of fear. In children, this is also where like you have this kind of developmental difference. We talked about kind of 6 to 11 and kind of 12 to 17-year-olds. So oftentimes in 12 to 17-year-olds, they're going to be able to tell you that they're feeling pretty nervous and starting to panic and describe that in a lot of detail. Younger children don't necessarily, again, have the language of anxiety in that same way, or the language of kind of like feelings identification in quite the same way. So this might be expressed in kids by tantrums, kind of hiding behind parents, clinging to your leg, freezing, all of those things that we kind of think of that might be more characteristic in kind of like preschool, kind of early childhood, so that before kind of age 8. But you can see that certainly linger on a little bit older, just depending on kind of developmental age and stage of each individual child. It has to create impairment. So that list that we just talked about, that it must be preventing them to be successful in a variety of different ways to be characteristic of social anxiety disorder. It also has to be present for 6 months or longer. And I'll highlight that one specifically because I feel like a lot of the social challenges that kids might have experienced kind of getting back to school this fall, because of the lack of ability to practice that in the same way that they might in other typical school years, it wasn't really part of last school year for most kids. And so this idea of it has to be present for 6 months or longer, I would think of a lot of what's going on in terms of kind of social stress still in kind of that adjustment category. So if it persists for longer than 6 months, then I might think about this as social anxiety. And oftentimes, right, you'll also hear that kids were pretty nervous in these situations before COVID, but COVID kind of spiked, right, this fear. And so we might argue that that was present for a lot longer than that, but it wasn't necessarily impairing, or it didn't really come to the attention of, kind of needing a mental health kind of consultation or treatment, because we also weren't doing a lot of things in COVID quite as much. And so it didn't create that same level of impairment. So we could argue that it kind of delayed a lot of kind of social anxiety diagnoses as well, and effective treatment, because we weren't doing some of those things for a longer period of time. And then it couldn't be related to another condition, right? So we know that, I'll just say autism in particular. So we know that autism spectrum disorders have a component related to social situations. And we would not necessarily think about kind of social anxiety in the context of autism. You can obviously diagnose those things together, so you can look at those kind of separately, but we would also know that there would be a certain amounts of social challenges that might come along with autism. So it's important to kind of think about differentiating those and really identifying kind of what's the bigger kind of underlying source of impairment, or what's the way that we're kind of thinking about changing some of those behaviors. We talked about this modifier for anxiety that's only present in public speaking situations. So what's cognitive behavioral therapy? And I'll just give you a little snapshot of this, because we're going to talk about some examples from a CBT perspective to give you a kind of a snapshot of what this kind of looks like in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. So in CBT, what we know is that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected together. So behavior is kind of what we do, and usually everybody can kind of identify that. So most kids can identify what they do in a situation that they're nervous. Adults, teachers can identify that too. Feelings
Sometimes kids, again, that's where you get a little bit more of that physiologic sign or that signal, but you might not necessarily have it described as anxiety or fear. But we're usually pretty good at identifying our feelings in large part. The part that we're not necessarily as good at accessing are thoughts. And so in CBT, the idea behind those are the automatic thoughts that occur to you in those situations that cause you to then feel a certain way and kind of act in a certain way. And so by better understanding the relationship between these, we can help you to start to kind of approach those situations and be more successful, and then kind of reset this thought in essence. So CBT really helps parents and kids to identify what that fearful thought is, how is their body kind of demonstrating that they're stressed, and then what are they doing? And most of the time what we're doing in those situations is avoiding it. So the most natural, predictable response to anxiety is avoidance, because we want to get out of a situation that makes us nervous. We want to escape from that situation. That's why kids hide behind their parents, right? It's like, look, you deal with that. This is making me uncomfortable. So we can identify some of those behaviors. And then basically what we want to do is help kids to start to kind of take steps to facing the fear and trying something new. Therapy is not cognitive behavioral therapy unless you're trying something new and facing the fear. So it's this idea of exposure, so that we have to expose you to something that you might be a little bit nervous about and get you to try it in a way that's comfortable and that's set up for success. And you kind of organize these things in a pretty specific way. But also we want to make sure that you're starting to approach these situations instead of avoiding them. Because if you continue to avoid them, what happens is that the fear actually grows. There's less of this thought content for younger kids versus older kids and teenagers. Again, just the complexity of the thought behind it. You oftentimes get big feelings and big behaviors, but there's not a lot of like, what's the reason that you're nervous? It just helps you, it makes you feel uncomfortable. And that might be all that you kind of know about that situation. Whereas older kids can tell you, like, here are all the things that I'm worried about from a negative evaluation perspective. And then we just help you to, again, try things new, and we give kids rewards for that because it's hard to start to shift some of these things, and we want them to feel successful. So here's a couple examples about how social anxiety might play out in a peer or a classroom situation. So social anxiety is going to overestimate this likelihood of a negative outcome or a negative view by others. So in a peer situation, you might be kind of thinking to yourself, and you might not again realize this, but like, they won't let me play the game at recess. I don't think they're going to let me join. What does that cause? The stomach ache, kind of feeling sweaty. You may or may not be able to say, yes, that makes me nervous, or that makes me uncomfortable. A lot of times you'll get uncomfortable in some form or fashion as that initial response to anxiety. And then what do you do in that situation? So you play by yourself. You might swing, you might choose something that's kind of a solitary activity that you also enjoy, right? So it's not that you're doing nothing or that you're standing there, not doing anything at recess, but you're choosing something that doesn't necessarily kind of involve you in the group because you're worried about what that evaluation is or that risk of somebody saying no. So you avoid asking the question. In a classroom anxiety example, you might be thinking, I'm going to get the wrong answer. This is a pretty common one. And you might feel panicked, kind of danger, stress. You might have all of those same kind of stomach aches, headaches, kind of uncomfortable feeling. And then what do you do in that situation? You avoid raising your hand so that you're going to really kind of lay low, right, so to speak. So you're not going to make eye contact. The teacher's going to say, does anybody have any questions? And you're going to kind of look to the side or keep your head down and avoid raising your hand because you really want the teacher not to pick on you in that situation. You really want her not to say, oh, hey, right, Katie, do you have a question? It's like, no. You're hoping for that not to happen because you're so worried about this negative evaluation. And that can happen with, answers that you might give to questions that the teacher's asking. And also something that happens in response to, if you have a question about the material, they're also nervous to ask the question because you're worried about how people are going to view that. Is it a dumb question? What are kids going to think because I asked this question? So it can play out in a variety of ways. So I'll pause here for a second and see if there are any questions about that first part before we think about kind of social skills and friendship development a little bit more. So any questions thus far? It looks like no, but if there's one that pops up, we can certainly address that. So let's think a little bit about social skills and friendship development. So we have this kind of backdrop of what's kind of social anxiety look like and that fear of evaluation. Now let's think about kind of the task of developing friendships. So what skills are really required for successful social relationships? And if we look at this list could continue, right? So I could think of subtle, like different things to add to this list all day if I was really trying to create a comprehensive list. But I really want you to think about in your own kind of social relationships and in friendships that you had that were pretty successful in childhood,
what are the features that characterize social success? And again, this is going to be different. We'll talk about the stages as you kind of get older, but in general, it involves all of the things in some form or fashion from this list. So this idea of social reciprocity, so this give and take in friendships. So we might all want to play, let's say, kickball at recess, but we have different ideas about what the rules are and who's going to be on a team and who gets to go first and how do we make some of those decisions. And we have this kind of back and forth exchange, right, a reciprocal exchange to then decide those tasks and kind of understand that information. And we both know that we're really interested in this and we're kind of invested and kind of socially involved in kind of this back and forth process to get that resolved so that we can play the game and have fun. So there's this natural back and forth. This happens a lot with questions too, so that if your younger kids get really excited to talk about things and oftentimes kind of start by telling stories to friends. But in some form or fashion, that starts to then shift and we need to really think about like how open is the other person to wanting to kind of hear the story, or are they giving us some of these like kind of nonverbal cues that are saying I'm a little bit bored and I'd like to move on, or are they trying to kind of interject and kind of get us to a different topic, those types of things. So you have to have sufficient nonverbal skills as well. So are you picking up on some of the cues that happen, right? So if I'm kind of raising my hand or gesturing, if there's somebody behind you that I'm kind of invite to join the group, are you picking up on that cue and saying, oh, okay, it looks like so-and-so might join, and then we're kind of welcoming them? Are we picking up on facial expressions and tone of voice and all of those things, again, that are kind of nonverbal cues? And I think about this related to mask wearing a lot, so that we don't necessarily see all of those things. When I think about that from a therapy perspective, it's nice to actually be able to do telehealth, so then not have a mask right present in those situations, because it's harder to read some of those cues from a therapy perspective, just like it's hard to read those cues for friends, especially if you don't know the other kids that you're kind of interacting with and you're meeting new friends. It really highlights some of that anxiety, I think, for a lot of kids. And then you have to
recognize and kind of be putting off these cues. You also have to know how to read and appreciate those cues, right? So I have to kind of modulate my voice and kind of interact in certain ways, but other people also have to be able to read that, right, to have an effective social interaction. Patience is huge for younger kids. So this development of the back and forth and kind of turn taking and your ability to kind of hear out maybe a story and then wait for your turn in a conversation, or wait for your turn to kind of go next, right? And like kickball or something like that requires a lot of patience. And younger kids, if I'm thinking about the 6 to 8 year olds, that's a big developmental task, is this idea of patience and kind of turn taking. Taking perspectives of others. So certainly as you get older, being able to understand kind of what your friend might be thinking in a situation and why it caused them to kind of act in a certain way, or what made them kind of make this choice, and being able to see like, oh, I understand why you thought that the rule was like this, and I'm just going to use kickball again. But if I'm thinking about that, oh, here's why I feel like, you know, you thought that this was a rule kind of similar to baseball, but we might have to do that a little bit differently in our game because of this reason. So your ability to perspective take for others can really be helpful as you're trying to then kind of negotiate and have these reciprocal relationships. You also have to have sufficient pro-social skills. And so when I think about pro-social skills, I'm really talking about the, the helping, kind of sharing, like other friendship kind of behaviors, kind of complimenting, a lot of those, behaviors that we would say, oh, this is like, that's really friendly, right? That you're respectful, that you're positive, that you're able to share information, kind of back and forth nicely, help them when, they might need a little bit of help, those types of things. You also have to have a base kind of social skill set. And this relates specifically to how do you navigate social interactions. So not necessarily just kind of helping, sharing those types of things, but introducing yourself. So how do you walk up to a group and tell them kind of what your name is, or kind of look for that opportunity to kind of join a group? How do you then kind of successfully join a group? How do you ask to join a group? And how do you try and kind of negotiate your place or your role in a game? Holding conversations and doing that in a back and forth reciprocal kind of way. How do you do all of those things? It requires a skill set, and you have to practice those things. Those get better as kids get older. And again, the list continues, so that you have to have all of these pieces to really have those like socially successful interactions. So if we think about the skills that are required, and now we kind of think about putting that in the context of friendships, that as kids age, there's a natural kind of development of social relationships that also change. And you'll hear language, right, oftentimes from play dates to kind of like hanging out, follow some of these stages that we're going to talk about below as well. But overall, friendship stages kind of boil down to 3 main categories. So you've got stage one, and this is really kind of more characteristic of our preschool age children, and then going into kind of early elementary school, so our kindergartens, first grade. So our 4 to 7-year-olds overall, friendship is really characterized by short, kind of brief relationships, and that friends are really for the purpose of fun. So I think about this a lot when I think about playgrounds. And so when now playgrounds are open again, but they weren't open for a long period of time at COVID. So when I'm thinking about younger kids and your ability to kind of make a friend when you go to the playground, a lot of kids will report, oh yeah, I have lots of friends. Like I saw a couple of friends at the playground and we did this, and then I kind of went home. You may never see those other kids that you saw at the playground again, but your relationship again with them was characterized by like an activity that you both mutually enjoyed that was for a pretty short period of time, and then you kind of went your separate ways. If you joined again, I thought you'd still enjoy like hanging out together in some of those activities, but it's really characterized by more of those brief kind of short relationships and something that's fun, interesting, like exciting, something that they're kind of joining and getting excited about. Stage 2 really starts to kind of develop between 8 and 10. And again, these ages are rough. And so based on, where your child is kind of developmentally, these might be a little bit, more or less accurate. But basically between 8 and 10, relationships start to be a little bit more like mutual. So this idea of reciprocity really starts to develop in this age range and this perspective taking. So relationships are agreed upon by both parties. So if I would ask kids, like, who are their friends would probably agree. It's like, oh, these are my 2 like closest friends, or these are my 2 best friends. And then I bet if I asked those people, they would also agree that that person is their friend. So it has to be kind of a mutually agreed upon relationship. It's also more focused on responding to others' needs and interests. So I might really want to play kickball, but I know that you really want to swing on the swing set because we haven't done that for a few days. So let's go ahead and do what you want to do. And how do I balance that with my own needs in that situation? But how do I also kind of work to foster this relationship with the other person through this give and take? Stage 3 is kind of 11 to then kind of 15 plus as we think about teenagers and then kind of into adulthood. So you have this greater depth and length of friendships. So friendships might continue for years in some cases, and you might have and you hear that people know people from elementary school and are still friends with them as they, graduate college and continue in their lives, so that you have this great depth and length of friendships that can really start to emerge then. And it emphasizes this idea of being loyal. So, I trust you. I know that you're going to be there for me. And that looks like each of these 3 things. It means that we turn take pretty nicely. It means that if I really need something or I'm upset about something, that I think that you're going to be there for me and kind of have my back, so to speak. And a mutual understanding and kind of sharing of interests and perspectives and those types of things. And again, that emerges in our later elementary school, but really thinking about middle school and kind of headed into high school. So how do challenges develop throughout this time? So, just thinking about all of the skills that we've talked about so far, I feel like there are many different ways that can go awry. We also know that throughout childhood and adolescence, there are going to be times where friendships are challenged and that situations are stressful. And that's a pretty typical part of development. So negotiating kind of like recess and playground and lunch situations is where I probably spend most of like my clinical time kind of navigating some of these social relationships, because they're usually the least structured, right? Most kind of social times of the day. But then you start to kind of have some of these challenges emerge where you're trying to figure out how do you exactly start to kind of navigate who, we're going to play this person's favorite game again. And this is the 5th day that we've kind of played that. So that conflicts are naturally going to occur. And it's helpful to figure out how to resolve those. So one of the ways that, again, you can be more effective in social relationships is figuring out how to resolve those and getting a little bit of practice and when it's reasonable and kind of appropriate to do that. Obviously, I'm not thinking about anything that would create safety issues or, would be considered kind of targeted bullying or anything like that. But there's going to be some challenges and some growing things that happen throughout childhood with regard to peers and social relationships. Stressors that limit interactions certainly create more challenges. So COVID, and we're going to talk about that more specifically, but then other medical conditions, right? So also kind of breaking a leg for a certain period of time doesn't put you in kind of the same maybe recess group that it would beforehand, because you really can't do some of the things that you would have been able to do before, and or that you can't even go out right on the playground in those situations because it's dangerous or you could risk re-injury. So there are other situations that happen, right, that are again kind of more medical that might take you out of that typical social interaction for a certain period of time. Language development and delays in language development can certainly impact social relationships and create some challenges. So
expressive language and receptive language both. So being able to understand what other kind of peers are saying, but also being able to generate, right, kind of what you really want people to say and be able to articulate that in a way that helps people to understand, you know, how you're thinking and feeling and what your ideas are about activities. And then mental health impact. So we know that things like we're talking about kind of social anxiety tonight specifically can have an impact. So if I'm really stressed and avoiding those situations, I'm really not getting any practice on these skills. So that might create skills deficits, but it might also create kind of performance deficits where I might know how to do these things, but I'm really nervous to do it. And so that might create, right, kind of a lack of friendships. ADHD, we also know, can create significant social skills challenges. So typically kids with ADHD would be behind kind of their social peers in terms of the stages. And if we think about the stages and ages, so kids with ADHD typically hang on to a little bit more of that like short relationship, kind of like fun, brief activity stage a little bit longer because of some of the activity level, right, impulsivity challenges that you'll see that occur until more kind of like 10, kind of that middle childhood age. When other kids are kind of starting to age out of that a little bit. Selective mutism, depression, again, there are a lot of mental health conditions that would create a social impact. So all of these things could certainly predict that you would see challenges arise. So thinking specifically about the impact of COVID on social development, it was actually a little bit tough kind of making this list and thinking about all of the different ways that COVID has certainly impacted our kids. And I do think that kids have really taken a hard hit from COVID in a social way. I mean, again, not that adults haven't, but my job is to kind of think about kids specifically. And I think it's been really tough on kids in a variety of different ways. So if I think about that early part of COVID, we had really limited interactions outside of a small group of individuals or just direct family members for those first 3 to 4 months of the pandemic. So remembering way back, right, to kind of March 2020, way back, it's not that long, but March 2020 to May, June of 2020, where we had remote school for almost everybody the majority of the time. And again, we're really kind of punished, right, for having interactions outside your house. And I mean punishment meaning like that it wasn't something that people thought was like safe or a good idea at that point. Sports, birthday parties, playgrounds, scouts, all the
Activities that we would think about kids doing. Girls on the run, right? Skating rinks, jump parks, right? Restaurants, anything that we would think about like a novel social interaction or a more regular kind of social interaction that's kind of for practices and games or kind of parties, all of those things really kind of went away in large part and haven't necessarily all come back right at the same level either. Mitigation of risk in schools required separation. So to be able to return to in-person class, if we're thinking about this kind of headed into the summer and fall of 2020, to reduce that risk, it required separation and really managing interactions like lunch and recess and those types of things, because they were opportunities where you were unmasked and presented kind of a risk. So opportunities for play and right kind of talking and kind of being a kid, but also opportunities for risk. And so it had to be very tightly managed in a way that, again, I think most kids in schools were not necessarily at all familiar with doing. Kids and teens didn't really go with parents anywhere. So kids that used to be kind of tag along with you, right, to the grocery store and right to Target and those types of things, that we really didn't. We minimized the amount that we were doing those things. And so that eliminates that as kind of a potential social interaction for saying hi to somebody or kind of asking a question to somebody or right encountering a friend that you might have not seen for a while and saying hi and kind of chit-chatting with them for a few minutes. Kids and teens also sought non-social activities for important. Now, I also appreciate, so I'm highlighting video games here. I think video games actually became very social in the pandemic. And so don't get me wrong, I don't have a negative overall opinion about video games, but I think we sought those types of activities a lot more because we didn't have the option to do anything that was in person and kind of social in a more classic way. And so we gravitated to things that were not necessarily a function of a direct kind of one-on-one face-to-face social interaction, which is different in terms of how do you navigate that and how are you kind of brave in those situations. Again, lots of lack of practice and kind of interactions where we were talking, or you might say hi to people kind of in your neighborhood on a walk, or you might pop by and say hi to a neighbor. We really weren't saying that those were safe things to do. So we were kind of punishing those and saying like, don't do that, stay to yourself. And again, all of that has a collective impact on, social development. And I think about that in two ways. Does it increase social anxiety? Absolutely. I also think that it impacts your ability to develop these base social skills. And so when I think about preschoolers, if you were a 3-4-year-old at the start of the pandemic and you're transitioning to kindergarten now, I don't think that you've had the same opportunity, right, to kind of socialize and have this kind of more rich social experience where you start to practice and develop some of these skills and kind of test them out, so to speak. Preschool is a big time for kind of testing out and figuring out kind of what's your face value and how do you join groups and how do you introduce yourself and how do you play a variety of things and kind of share and help. And I feel like, again, kids in that age range missed a lot there. I feel like older kids also didn't necessarily get an opportunity to start doing things that were a little bit more independent, right? Where you might kind of go over to somebody's house and hang out there for a little bit of time. That we didn't do those things. And so all of the interactions that we had were a lot more monitored and managed. And it's a little bit more difficult to then figure out how do you kind of navigate some of these situations and be more confident in that environment. The ongoing impact of COVID. So the pandemic isn't over. We all know that. But again, a lot of these kind of pieces still have kind of lasting effects. So what's the lasting effect of all of those kind of more strict parameters that we had early in the pandemic, but also like how does this impact us in a way because these guidelines are kind of changing still, right? And we are giving a lot of mixed messages potentially about social interactions. So comfort with social interactions, again, still limited. And it varies a lot, right, based on activity that you're kind of participating in and then family kind of circumstances and feelings about that, especially for younger children, right? So younger children don't really go over to people's houses very often on their own. And if you're having to bring a parent or somebody or another sibling along with you, it really puts, I think, some of those younger kids at a particular disadvantage because they can't necessarily have that same level of independence that older kids have or that teenagers have. There's different rules for social interactions and these things change. And so it's hard sometimes for kids to kind of think about, well, what are the rules? And if you're thinking about anxiety like we are tonight, then a lot of anxious kids don't want to break the rules. And so it's harder to feel more confident in those social situations. And that social interaction still creates some fear of infection and risk and that safety part, again, which is kind of a particular anxiety trigger as well. But I think all these things continue to impact kind of what we're seeing day to day with kids. I will certainly say that as a clinician, and in my 15 years of practice, that I've seen more kind of social anxiety and then also just challenges navigating some of typical kind of like playground situations, those types of things that kids would have had a lot more exposure and experience doing, creating a lot more stress just because there's not really a way to kind of think about those things. They haven't developed kind of a base and some comfort in those situations. So what can we do to help, right? This idea of kind of social coaching. I'll pause here quickly to see if there are any questions. Anybody have a question about anything that we've talked about so far? No? Okay. So let's think a little bit about what we can do to help. So we'll transition from kind of the, I feel like a little doom and gloom from COVID and think about what we can do to kind of help to take advantage of some of these opportunities and help kids to catch up a little bit. So our areas of opportunity and kind of skill development. So I think about social kind of anxiety and then social skills and friendship development in a lot of different ways. And so the levels of intervention and where you kind of think about intervening can be really different based on each individual child. And again, whether there's social anxiety present or not. So there's kind of individual skill development, meaning that I'm going to talk with you kind of one-on-one about skills like introducing yourself, joining your group, social problem solving, those types of things. There are groups where kids practice those. So schools oftentimes have groups where kids are able to practice some of those skills and kind of do them together, right? Things like introducing yourself or conflict resolution, that type of stuff. Parents and caregivers can coach and practice skills too. So a lot of times kids will have siblings and that's a really nice kind of natural, right, kind of play date situation basically. Yes, I know the dynamic between siblings is a little bit different, but it's a really nice opportunity to take advantage of how to coach some of these skills and kind of being a friendly sibling is really important, like being a friendly, peer. And so really just thinking about ways that you start to kind of pay attention and kind of reward and coach these behaviors at home. Rewarding positive social behaviors. So how much do I focus on sharing and helping and, saying a kind word or a compliment to somebody? And again, you can see those opportunities in your house day to day. I'm also thinking about generalization. So how do I think about these skills? So if I see these skills at home, do I see them across other social situations? So like a sports activity or a scouting activity, do I see those at recess? Does the school see those in the classroom? Do I see that same level of behavior in multiple different settings? Because that could tell me, again, if I'm seeing that at home, that you have the skills, but you're not necessarily comfortable practicing it across different settings. And I would intervene a little bit differently there. And then just practice managing and working through these conflicts together. So being able to kind of have these conversations that are just a regular part of a development, but kind of thinking about
them as intentional conversations to try and build up this skill set and help them to have a little bit more confidence navigating these situations. And I think about that one in particular because that happens a lot as you're just kind of doing your something what I call the daily download of the day. So kids will tell you kind of what happened throughout the day, and if there's anything that kind of like happens that might be in this kind of conflict category, that just being intentional about kind of having that conversation and thinking through what was their perspective, what were other people thinking, can really help them to be more confident and kind of build this skill. And then when you're thinking about identifying areas of opportunity, so let's say that you feel like there are a couple of areas where your child might be struggling. I want you to think about identifying specific behaviors or situations that are problematic for your child. So not just like all social skills are difficult. Most kids are actually pretty good at some social skills and pretty adept at different situations. And then they really struggle in others. And so really kind of thinking about and tracking some data about where are they successful now? So where do you see them the most confident, the most relaxed, the most engaged socially? That's probably the situation where they're using all of these skills, and it's a good opportunity for you to see like what they kind of know how to do and what they maybe don't know how to do. And then identifying where do they struggle. So what are the areas that they really struggle in now? And how do you start to kind of think about those and break those down a little bit more? Once you find a behavior that you think is something that could use a little bit of work, then you identify kind of the opposite of that behavior. And so once we kind of think about, okay, boy, turn taking is a big challenge. And this is a big challenge for lots of kids. I might argue that actually sharing is it's another version of turn taking, but the world might boil down to sharing in terms of resources and time and activities and all those other things. But it's really hard for younger kids to think about this idea of letting somebody else go first. And so I'm thinking about if they're really struggling with turn taking, then what I would really need them to do to be a little bit more successful is probably give somebody else that opportunity to go first. Let somebody else have a turn before you, and do that strategically and systematically to practice this, to see what happens in those situations, because other kids are probably really going to appreciate that, and then they're going to be more likely, right, to invite you to do something in the future. I also think about another example of this with like conflict resolution. So kids sometimes would have an idea about how they wanted to solve the problem. Kids are really egocentric in a lot of ways, so they're thinking about their perspective a lot. And so as they think about that for conflict resolution, they might have 3 or 4 ideas that they felt like were good ways to solve this problem. But the other members of the group didn't agree about that. And so trying to have somebody else identify a solution and really kind of going with that and playing that out and seeing how that goes. So being flexible in terms of conflict resolution. Determining whether your child has a knowledge deficit or a skills deficit is also important. So as you're thinking about kind of identifying either a situation or a behavior, then I want you to kind of break it down and think about, is this knowledge or is this kind of a performance deficit? And that will help you to decide kind of where you start in terms of intervention. So a knowledge deficit is something that would indicate that the child doesn't necessarily have the skill, so that they don't know how to really join a group or kind of introduce themselves, that they're really struggling with conflict resolution and being able to take somebody else's perspective. And so I want you to think about, how do you teach that skill and how do you like break that down for them step by step? So here's what you might say when you join a group. Let's practice doing that. Here are 2 or 3 things that you would say. So if they say not today, or right, we've already kind of given out like the jobs for today, then how would you think about managing that situation? Say, oh, okay, well, I'll try and play again tomorrow. And they might say, sure, yeah, join us tomorrow. But you're asking, you're really working through and asking kind of questions. You're predicting what this interaction is going to look like to really teach them this skill, because they don't necessarily have that knowledge or that skill that helps them to be successful in that situation. I'm then going to practice that, reward that across different times and settings where then I master that. And then I kind of take it on the road, so to speak. So if I can do that consistently at home in ways that we can kind of practice that in a more friendly, kind of welcoming environment, then how can I do that in an environment that might be a little bit more risky from an anxiety perspective, and kind of generalize that? It's a little bit harder to predict what peers are going to do on the playground. And so that might be kind of your generalizing the skill area. A performance deficit kind of follows this acquisition of knowledge. And so you have to have the skill and the ability to demonstrate that skill before you can really perform the skill at the time that you need it. Oftentimes kids, again, when I'm thinking about social anxiety, might have this skill, but just be really nervous about using it. Where sometimes with things like ADHD, you might not have the skill and you're not necessarily able to kind of remember it or perform that in the moment. Again, it varies, right, based on every child's kind of unique situation. But the performance deficit is really, how can I use this? So I have the ability to introduce myself and join a group, and I do that in some situations, but I don't really do it at school because I'm a little bit more worried about what other people are going to think, or what if they say no in that situation. So you really want to reinforce them for times that they are doing this and kind of taking some chances to kind of show that they know this skill, to kind of test it out in different situations. and problem solve about ways to increase their usage, barriers to the skill. And then sometimes it actually is kind of calming down, right? So kind of calming down how stressed that you might be, or how angry, let's say, that you might be that somebody didn't agree with you, to then help you demonstrate one of these skills in a situation where you need to. So keys to successful intervention. And there's a good number here, but I had trouble kind of thinking about a shorter list because I think all these are important. So keys to being successful with intervention, you really want to make sure kids have the knowledge. So you don't want to make an assumption that they know how to do this, and then they really don't necessarily. And you're just having them try to perform a skill that they really don't feel like they've confidently mastered. So how do they know, how do you know that they can do it? And I'm thinking about that part actually more even as a clinician, when I'm doing kind of like I'm assessing social skills and kind of peer interactions, I'm assuming actually that kids are not necessarily able to do those things as well as they could before COVID, because I think some of what we did kind of have as, pretty good skills and knowledge has not necessarily been the case in my experience. So how do we know for sure that they can demonstrate the skill? And where are they using that successfully now? And so if you can't really identify a situation that they're using that skill or joining a group successfully, they might not really know how to do it. So you might have to start with that knowledge acquisition phase. Setting them up to be successful in practice. And so you think about setting the bar lower to really help them encourage using the skill and being confident in trying to do that. And so I would rather err on the side of caution than set a goal that's too high and then have them fail in that situation. And that can again be like something that you would accomplish by helping kids to understand like who might they join at recess, who gives them some of these cues that would say like they're kind of interested in being friends with them, or that they talk to them more, or that they're more comfortable kind of joining that group, so that you're picking kind of a situation that you feel like they're probably most likely to be successful. Enlisting the help of schools and other environments where kids engage in social interactions is really important, because kids are going to get the most practice and the most opportunity in those situations. That at home is not necessarily one of the places that kids are always going to have the most novel kind of social interactions and ability to practice them. Parents need to be calm and positive coaches. I know that's hard sometimes, right? So seeing some of these things, when you get a lot of clingy behavior, and especially when you see a lot of that anxiety, it's difficult for parents to stay calm and kind of be a positive coach. Oftentimes because you see them demonstrating these skills at home, and then they're not able to do it kind of in a new environment, and you're kind of surprised by that. So the ability for parents to stay calm and then think about like, okay, do they know how to do this? Do they need a little bit of coaching? And how can I kind of motivate them to take a risk or a chance in this situation to help them be successful? Again, most of the time people do want to be friendly. They do want to like have social interactions, and they're excited about that. But it's a risk. It's a calculated risk sometimes for kids to try and take that step. So thinking about reward programs. So really quick, immediate
Rewards for those positive behaviors. So for sharing, for letting somebody go first, for letting somebody cut in front of you, in line, or saying, hey, it's okay, we got here at the same time, you can go first. And seeing then what's the reaction of the other kid, right? Other kids usually appreciate that. They'll say, oh, thanks, like I appreciate that. And then that helps them to see that they're really successful, and that's kind of a positive return on their investment. Creating opportunities to practice and coach, and kind of thinking about this at home and on the fly, so to speak, in different activities. So really practicing ahead of time. So what are you going to do in this situation? So we're going to get to school, and your teacher's going to open the door, and then what are we going to say to her? I think you could say good morning. And then practicing like, okay, so when we get to school and rehearsing that on the way to school, you're going to open the door and you're going to say good morning. And then what do you think your teacher's going to say? Oh, good morning. Or, how are you? I'm good. And then you're going to go on kind of about your way. So practicing and predicting and kind of giving them some scripts to use. What are common answers to questions? What are people typically going to ask in these situations? So using kind of your expertise and experience to help them predict how to be more successful. And then again, practicing asking questions too. So this back and forth kind of reciprocal is oftentimes a really good skill to kind of think about at dinner time, or times that you have kind of that time that you're kind of talking about the day. So letting you ask questions about their day versus them just telling you all of the stories, and using that as an opportunity to practice this back and forth. So working with other systems, we talked about this a little bit, but the school is a really important partner when you're thinking about kind of managing social anxiety and building up social skills and friendship skills. So really helping the school to understand that these are some things that you're working on, enlisting the help of teachers and counselors and other school administrators to really reinforce and practice some of these things. I have found schools overwhelmingly helpful and interested in practicing these skills, because developing these skills helps everybody. And it prevents
a lot of the challenges, right, that you might kind of see or kind of think about from a school perspective. So again, I find schools very, very much kind of a helpful, active partner in this. And then they might have opportunities for like groups or other ways that you can kind of join a lunch bunch, or other types of things that might help to kind of build some of that social confidence. And then sharing information about what you're working on at home. So here are 2 or 3 things that we're kind of working on at home that we've noticed are harder. And here's what we're doing and how we're seeing some success. Or if you are in kind of a therapy intervention about social anxiety, what are the specific goals that you're working on? And what are some ways that you can help to kind of have kids continue some of that progress and really implement some of that at school? I also think making a list of other situations where your child can interact with others is really helpful. And I think that list would be different from prior to COVID and now in a COVID time as well. And so really kind of thinking about what are all the ways that kids could kind of interact and practice some of these skills in small ways. So that might be in activity leaders, kind of church groups, scouting leaders, sports coaches, other family members, right, neighbors, you know, that you pass when you're walking your dog every day that you can say hi to. There are a lot of different ways that you can kind of create that opportunity, but you have to be pretty creative, I think. I think COVID has certainly encouraged us and really challenged our skills upon creativity to help us really think about what are ways that we can create this practice in kind of safe and more predictable ways. Lastly, thinking about this again from an anxiety perspective to kind of come full circle with our cognitive behavioral approach to social anxiety is that we know that approaching these situations and facing your fears is going to help kids to have how to figure out to manage these situations and not avoid them anymore. Again, we know the more avoidance that happens, the bigger that intensity of reaction is. So it builds the fear, it reinforces the fear because again, they didn't engage in that situation. So if we play out some of those examples from before about social situations, if you didn't necessarily ask to join the group and you played by yourself, you might have had fun playing by yourself. But what that reinforces for you is that you avoided that situation, you felt better, that you weren't anxious. But you haven't necessarily figured out how to make a friend either. And that doesn't necessarily feel good at the end of the day. It creates anxiety that grows with more and more time, right? That you haven't necessarily kind of asked that question or broken down that barrier. So you can break any task down into a smaller part. We can do that with really any behavior, but social skills are no different. And providing the support to kind of help them be brave. So how can you be brave? And who do you think you could be brave with in this situation? Who's a little bit more comfortable? And who do you think is going to be pretty friendly if you try this out? And kids are going to know that, right? They have a sense of who's going to be safe for people to kind of try some of these skills out. Having kids really identify times that they were successful. So when did they really do this and you were impressed by what they did, or that they were impressed with themselves, and then helping them to relate that to this new situation. So that tells me, right, you did a great job on the playground, right, last weekend when you didn't know a lot of the kids and you guys all ended up playing this big game together. How do you think you could also do that at recess? Is that pretty similar? The good news is, again, it gets easier every time. So as kids face these fears and get experience with doing that, they're going to get good return on their investment. I think that social interactions are oftentimes a really fun one to start to coach because you usually see a pretty immediate return. So if you say, hey, can I join this group? And somebody says yes, then you have a pretty fun experience, right? Where you might have had kind of a very isolated experience before. And so you can really start to see the benefit of that effort. I apologize. My dog has joined us and is shaking. Using rating scales to help kids communicate about fear. So how hard would it be to join this group at recess? How hard would it be to raise your hand and ask a question in class? And what would make this a little bit easier? So would it be easier to, kind of join this group at recess versus this, or to sit by this peer because they kind of give you a lot of cues that they might be interested in kind of building a friendship, or that they might be interested in hanging out with you a little bit more. So helping them to start to be kind of good studiers of their environment and using some of what they're paying attention to. So,
The other thing that we know about kids that are anxious is they pay attention to everything. What they're paying attention to often kind of gets in the framework of this like fearful interaction. I see them kind of looking and kind of being thoughtful, but they're taking in all kinds of social data that we have to help them see how they can use in a way that's going to help to set them up with success versus kind of this avoidance. So any questions? I would love to hear any thoughts that you guys would have about this, or questions that kind of came up during the presentation tonight, so that we can kind of tailor this. I know usually everybody kind of joins hoping to kind of learn something in particular. And so if there are specific questions or examples that would be helpful to talk through, I'll be happy to answer those questions now. It's a quiet group this evening. You could be brave though, and be the first one to ask a question. Oh, I appreciate that. I see a question coming in. Thank you so much. Are there resources for helping to figure out what kind of same age peers are interested in to practice situations? Great question. Thinking about ways that you know kind of what most kids are kind of doing in a situation, or what most kids are kind of like thinking about. I would actually love to research your question a little bit more. I think that I pick up a lot of that knowledge. It's one of the things I actually like the most about my job, is I feel like I'm very connected to like what kids like to do, because I hear about different activities that they like to do all the time. But I'm not sure if there's like a particular resource that would be helpful to kind of think about, like, how would you kind of set them up for success to kind of talk about, let's say, like, what ages do kids really like Pokemon, or what ages do they, you know, kind of stop liking Pokemon and then kind of do something else? I think that's actually a great question. So what I'll do is I'll actually do a little bit of research about that. I'll see if I can find a specific resource. And if I do, I will send it to Allie and Janet so that they can include it with the recording, because I think that's a great question. And it does change a lot. I would also say that some of the things that I would have said were pretty big hits before COVID changed drastically. I didn't really talk about Fortnite at all before COVID. And I talk about it way more now than I ever did before. I know way more about it as the non-video game player. I know more about that game. I feel like I do play that sometimes. But I think it does change a lot. And so I'll be curious what I find in response to your question. So thanks for asking. Other questions? Any nonverbal skills to practice? Great question. I think that tone of voice is actually a really big one for me. And I think about this a lot. So I know we were talking about kind of social anxiety tonight, but I also think that it's a really nice way for kids to start to understand how excited that people might be when people start to get a little bit bored, when you hear that people are kind of a little bit anxious. So I really think about tone of voice a lot. I tend to be a pretty like loud right talker. And so thinking about ways to kind of practice that, and knowing that like this louder voice, right, that I'm using to kind of present isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think kids oftentimes like think about tone of voice as like a bad thing. So if you're a little bit louder, that kind of indicates something negative, but it doesn't necessarily. And so helping them to really think a little bit about kind of tone of voice, I think is a really big one. I also think some of those nonverbal cues about eye contact and kind of like what your mouth is doing. So are kids kind of smiling a little bit? Are they leaning in and kind of like interested to what you're saying? Are you seeing some of those things that might indicate that kids are listening and kind of attentive? And so I think about all of those things that would kind of help you to be kind of an attentive listener. Those are certainly skills that I would practice. I also think that if there are skills where you're kind of thinking about ways that kids are kind of wanting to join groups. So as kids kind of start to come and kind of stand pretty close to you, I'll practice this sometimes with siblings. And so sometimes kids, right, are not necessarily sure how to join a group. They'll have a bigger group and then kids will kind of come close. And what are they kind of waiting for in that situation, right? They're probably waiting for somebody to say, hey, right, would you like to kind of join in with us? Or hey, right, Jimmy, come and play with us. And so thinking about those nonverbal, again, kind of ways or like skills that they're sending you some of these like cues that might help you to think that these they're interested in kind of social interactions, or help you to then kind of navigate those. I think that's a great question. But those are some that I typically start with. Looks like we have another question or comment. So is there a resource to teach social skills explicitly, or like role playing with your child? So the best resource, I'll actually type this in so that you can see this. This is a resource that I think is really helpful for elementary school kids in particular. I have the elementary school version in my office. I'm not sure if they have an adolescent version or not, but it's called Skills Streaming. And I'll just put that in for you guys to see. Oh, I think it actually just sent it to Allie and I and Janet, but I'll put that in. So Skillstream is one of my favorite resources. And what it really does is it breaks down all of the skills that we're talking about into like 50 to 75 like sub skills, and teaches you how to practice them. It teaches base conflict resolution, but it starts at the very beginning with introducing yourself. How are you kind of being an attentive listener? How are you taking turns? And it gets more complex as the book kind of goes on. It also comes with a set of cards that are scenarios that you can practice. And so I used to teach a social skills group within the context of a school. And this is what I used as the curriculum, because I felt like it just was really straightforward and it didn't kind of make any assumptions, right? So that if we were all kind of at different levels, it gave us something each that we could kind of practice and would challenge us versus kind of assuming that we were all moving through them in kind of the same way. So everybody might have kind of a goal of the week and they would practice that in the context of the group. And then I would actually send some of these scenario cards home to parents. So I think it's an awesome resource. Great question. Any other questions? I think one big area that I would just kind of encourage people to kind of think about a little bit is this idea of conflict resolution. And so thinking about ways that you can practice perspective taking, that you can help kids to see different solutions. So that here's kind of one way that they thought about a solution, but what are 2 or 3 other ways that they can think of that they might solve a problem? And so when I'm trying to work on problem solving with kids, and I have them generate at least 3 solutions to any problem, so that you have a better sense of one, kind of, it gives you an idea about where their kind of knowledge base is and whether they can kind of take that perspective of other peers, because you can oftentimes as a parent predict kind of where the conflict kind of broke down or where it arose in the situation when you're hearing kind of kids go through it. But helping them to think about like what are the 3 solutions and then what would have happened potentially from going through each of these solutions. So really kind of playing that out a little bit, saying if you chose the solution, what do you think would have happened and who would have kind of responded in this way and what do you think would have kind of happened next, so that you can help them to really see if they can expand the amount of ideas that they can generate, because the more practice that they have with that kind of conflict resolution or generating solutions, the better actually equipped they are to manage a lot of different situations. So that's not necessarily just social situations, but they're thinking about how to solve when you don't necessarily know how to do something in class for the first time or those types of things. It applies in all of those different situations. But that's something that I really encourage families to think about together, especially as you're kind of getting to that your kind of transition to school. So starting it in kind of kindergarten and 1st grade, but then really building that in terms of complexity as you get to middle school and kind of those dynamics change. And again, you get to more kind of back and forth relationships. Sometimes you can't always understand somebody else's perspective too, and it's okay, right? You as a parent might not be able to understand somebody else's perspective in certain situations, but then you can also help your child to kind of navigate those. So if they've been flexible, if they've tried a lot of ideas and it's still not necessarily working, and you can think about how to help them navigate that too, right? So sometimes your best efforts don't necessarily result in a solution that kind of benefits everybody either, and helping them kind of be equipped to be appropriately assertive and kind of manage some of those situations too. Any other thoughts or questions? Looks like maybe no questions. Okay.
Kami, I want to thank you so much. I took, as always the case, I took a lot of notes. This is applicable for parents, but obviously plenty of use for our day-to-day work here at Pilot.
Absolutely.
And just one thank you popped up in the Q&A. So not another question. So thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who attended.
Absolutely.
A well-attended session. I'm glad so many people were able to come out and enjoy this. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a lovely evening. And we will see you at our next session. Maybe Janet.
Just in January.
Yeah,
January.
So I think it's the right week after we come back from the break. Is that right?
it might be the 19th, I think. Why am I thinking that? Let's see.
Yeah, we'll push it out again.
Yeah. We'll push it out.
Yep.
No, it's not
Okay.
the 19th.
Yes, but absolutely. Thank you guys for being a great audience and learning along with us. And again, this is an area I think that we all kind of benefit from thinking about, but is a pretty common like day-to-day kind of school and parent interaction. So hopefully this gives everybody a few tips to feel a little bit more successful in those situations. So thanks for joining us. And thanks to you guys for hosting.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.